All right, hello everybody. It's Jonathan Talks, and today we're here to do a video on with a very special guest on something I want to do a video on for a while, which is the papacy, specifically as it's conceptualized in the First Vatican Council and later documents in like the Vatican II Council. But before we get into that, I just Swan, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us what your story is, and what you focus on and what you're doing and anything you're working on.
Yeah, well, Jonathan, thanks for having me on. My name is Suan Sonna. I'm a philosophy student at Kansas State University. I'm a Baptist convert to Catholicism. I currently run a YouTube channel and podcast called Intellectual Conservatism. And so on that channel, the main focus of it is to conserve ancient Christian thought on areas related to metaphysics, politics, theology. And so, obviously my work on the papacy is relevant to all of that. And then aside from that, I have a Medium page where I write on some of my research. I'm also active on academia.edu. I have a few of my essays published there. I also have a paper published by the Heathrop Journal titled Roman and Catholic, a Biblical and Historical Defense of Vatican I Papal Theology in Response to Jerry Walls. Jerry Walls is a prominent Protestant philosopher who wrote a book with Kenneth J. Collins called Roman but Not Catholic, where they raised some arguments against the papacy and other Catholic beliefs. So I was responding to them. And then right now I'm hoping to make progress on a book on the papacy from scripture and also the origins and development of the church in Rome. And so, I've been really busy with schoolwork lately and a lot of other things. And so I'm hoping to make progress on that sometime soon, but that'll take a bit.
Awesome. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, I've seen some content from Jerry Walls on Capturing Christianity. He actually seems sympathetic to certain Catholic views, like on purgatory, I think.
Oh, yeah. 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 He's sympathetic towards purgatory. I think he believes in some form of the real presence, and things like that. But, things about the papacy, about Mary, he's not as sympathetic towards.
Yeah, those are usually the last things to click. I remember when I was converting, the last thing to click for me in my head, like emotionally, even though I understood the arguments, was actually Mary. What was Mary and some of the papal stuff. So that's very interesting. And I asked because I saw him do a video on purgatory with Cameron Bertuzzi, I believe.
Yep.
But a lot of anyone who's looked at your content knows that you delve very deep into ancient Jewish theology and authority and the kind of structure they had for their authority. How does that help us better understand the New Testament and better understand Christianity as a whole? Like, what is the role of ancient Jewish theology in that project?
I mean, so I think a lot of people have this false idea that when Christianity came on the scene, we just totally did away with Judaism. We restarted everything. And the Old Testament is kind of, it's good for reading. It has some, the Psalms, the Proverbs. It has a lot of nice things and even some really important stories that eventually point to the New Testament. But really, the more you look at the New Testament, how heavily it cites from the Old Testament, how heavily it relies upon the Old Testament, but also other ancient Jewish documents. Like, for instance, in Jude chapter 1, verse 9, it talks about how the archangel, I believe it was Michael, fought over the body of Moses against Satan, right? Well, that's not in the Old Testament. That's going to be in the Assumption of Moses, which was written around the time of Jesus. I think it's about 4 BC is when some scholars date it. And so you see ancient Jewish extra-biblical, traditions appear in the New Testament. Or, for instance, if you don't have the deuterocanonical books, certain feast days and festivals that Jesus celebrates, they are unmentioned in the Old Testament. You need 1st and 2nd Maccabees in order to understand what's going on in the New Testament sometimes. And so even certain things that Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, like when he says all judgment has been given to the Son of Man, right? In the book of Enoch, which is written before the time of Christ, it also mentions the fact, at least in Messianic theology, this belief that when the Messiah would come, the Son of Man, the principal part of judgment over the entire world would be given to him. And so a lot of scholars point out that if it weren't for books like Enoch or 1st and 2nd Maccabees, a lot of what's going on in the New Testament would seem really foreign and strange. Like, if you're paying close attention to the continuity from the Old to the New Testament, if you don't have some of these extra biblical Jewish traditions or the writings, then you're going to miss a lot of things. And so, for if you're going to do an honest historical study of the New Testament, if you're going to study it like a scholar, but also if you're just going to study it honestly in its historical context, there are certain things that you can't forget or miss out on. And I think one of the most important ways to demonstrate this is when Jesus says to the apostles, "Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." When I was a Protestant, a Baptist, I read that passage and kind of glossed over it and turned the next page. I didn't think anything of it. But then when you look into the Jewish context of what it means to bind and loose, that is the rabbinic authority to interpret scripture, discipline the community, issue anathemas, and excommunicate heretics. And then when you look at it in that way, you start realizing that a lot of what the early Christians believed, that, their bishops could issue anathemas, excommunicate heretics, form an ecumenical council, they could declare doctrine on faith and morals. You start realizing, wait a minute, when you view it in the Jewish context, the New Testament lends and makes so much more sense of what the early Christians believed. And so I think it's indispensable in order to understand the New Testament. I mean, Jesus was a pious Jew. He was part of his daily Palestinian Jewish life. He went to the temple. He read in the synagogue. He celebrated the feast days. I mean, I don't know how you can say that Jesus wasn't a first century Palestinian Jew.
Yeah, and I think what's important for some people is because they think about Judaism, and what they typically think about is maybe more modern, I'll say, innovations that Jewish theology might have, or modern differences it might have with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that represents the same exact theology and same exact kind of authority structure as was present in the first century. And I think that's not necessarily the best way to go about it, because there have been a lot of, and maybe you disagree with me on this, but I think you would agree with me, is that there have been a lot of innovations in Judaism. So we're really trying to look at that first century Judaism and prior, and maybe a little bit after, but there are some distortions. And so we don't want to give people an idea that Christianity and Judaism today are the same religion. Is maybe what you're getting at, that Christianity is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It is the Old Testament religion fully developed and unpacked in the New Covenant.
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely the argument that I would make, right? That the New Testament is in continuity with the Old Testament, right? That the Messiah and all the things that he did in the New Testament were exactly what, if the Jewish people during the time of Jesus, if they had been looking more closely, they would have seen, wait a minute, this is exactly what the Messiah said he was going to do, right? And so you look at a lot of the Jewish messianic expectations or prophecies, and you see that Jesus fulfilled them down to a T, And so, for instance, one of the Jewish messianic prophecies was that the Messiah would rebuild the Sanhedrin. When you look in the New Testament, you see Jesus gathering 70 disciples and sending them out. This is exactly what Moses did in the Old Testament, right? And so I would say that there's a remarkable continuity between Old Testament and Second Temple Judaism with the early Christian doctrines and beliefs of the church. And so to have a sharp distinction between the two isn't quite right. And moreover, the early Christians, they actually worshipped in the Jerusalem temple before it was destroyed in 70 AD. And so a lot of early Christians saw themselves in continuity with Judaism, or they saw themselves as just fellow Jews. The only difference is they had the Messiah, right? And what's funny too is that even in the second century, which is still, after the parting of ways occurs sometime in the first century, maybe the early second century, when Christians and Jews formally identified themselves as members of two separate religions. Well, there was a revolt being led by a Jewish zealot in the second century. This zealot's name was Bar Kokhba, right? So he's leading this revolt against Rome. And what's interesting is that a lot of the Jews reached out to Christians and said, "Hey, brothers and sisters, let's join Bar Kokhba. He's the Messiah. Let's fight against him," right? So some of the Jews still viewed Christians as their brothers and sisters, as they were part of the same religion. And then the early Christians, they said, "Sorry, Bar Kokhba is not the Messiah. Yeshua is," And so it's just remarkable how even the early Christians so closely identified themselves with Judaism. And I can go on and on about all these examples. But I think the point is made sufficiently clear.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that I discovered, not when necessarily looking into Judaism itself, but when looking at particular areas of New Testament studies, is that Matthew, particularly, which is the gospel we're going to get to in a couple
Yeah.
minutes, is a very, for lack of a better term, like a very Jewish gospel. There's a lot of Jewish theology in Matthew. Some people even think it goes down to like certain things about marriage. There's a lot of Jewish kind of theology in the background of Matthew that isn't in Mark, because Mark is written for more of an audience that isn't as familiar with the Jewish culture and things like that. Would you kind of agree with that take?
Yeah, I mean, and that's also the belief of many scholars that Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish of the four. And the reason why is because, as you mentioned before, certain Jewish themes appear, but also, for instance, if you look at the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, right, they obviously differ. And if you try to reconcile them or try to harmonize them, it doesn't really work all that well. And so scholars like Michael Licona have pointed out that if you use the ancient Hebraic system called gematria, right, where certain consonants were given certain numerical values, and the Jews would use this as a kind of code system, right? So they would, for instance, the number of David would, I believe, be 13, right? So you have, or 14 rather. So, for instance, D, I think, would be like, if I'm trying to remember properly, like it would be associated with a number, like D would be a number, V would be a number, and D would once again be a number. So not the vowels, right? And if you add up the numbers in the gematria system, it would lead you to the number 14. Well, when you look inside Matthew's gospel in his genealogies, he is very clear that he's establishing that Jesus had three sets of 14, three sets of 14 generations, right? That's how he establishes his genealogy. And the point is that 14 is the number of David, and 3 is a number of emphasis in Judaism. And so, even from the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, you see this very clear reference to an ancient Hebraic system. You can also point out different passages where Matthew seems to be pro-Pharisee, or he seems to at least support at least some notion of rabbinic authority and the oral Torah, which we can get into later. But the point here is that, yeah, Matthew's gospel is clearly the most Jewish of the four. But also, it contains some of the harshest criticisms, too, of the Jewish people. And so it's an interesting combination.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and you could have a whole show dedicated to all the Jewish themes in Matthew, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, you pointed out an interesting parallel between the Old Testament, I believe Moses having 70 followers, yep, and then in the New Testament, Jesus having about 70 disciples. And that seems to be playing on something that's commonly called typology in Scripture. So, and this is something that's, it's not as solid, I think, as other ways of interpreting the Scripture. That's not to say it's not as useful or as efficient, but it could be a little bit harder for especially our Protestant friends to kind of wrap their heads around, certain Protestants, of course, and even certain Catholics. So what exactly is typology? And what exactly guards us? Because once you explain what typology is, people are going to say that you can do all sorts of weird things with this method of interpretation. So what are the rails on typology? When does typology go too far?
Yeah, so typology is this view that what's in the Old Testament foreshadows and points to something in the New Testament. And so they're generally two views, right? So sometimes there are things in the Old Testament that explicitly say they will be fulfilled later. So in Deuteronomy 18:15, when Moses is about to die, he tells the Jewish people that one day a prophet like me will arise from among you, from among our countrymen, right? And then later on, Jesus in the New Testament is called, the prophet from Nazareth. He is recognized as, in some sense, carrying on the lineage of Moses, right? So to use an example, or the example of Moses, in the New Testament, Jesus says, or rather, I think it's in Mark and Matthew, it says that Jesus looked upon the people like sheep without a shepherd. And then in the Old Testament, Moses, is talking to God, begging for him to not let, his office as head shepherd of Israel go unfulfilled. And so he says, Lord, let them not be sheep without a shepherd, right? And so you see certain things that are in the Old Testament that are repeated in some form in the New Testament. They're elevated, perhaps. They are, they're repeated in some structure and manner. So that's what typology means. A certain type or image or event is repeated in the New Testament, and it's there in the Old Testament. It might have been the case that it was anticipated in the Old Testament, or the New Testament author retroactively looks back and reflects and points out there's a parallel here. So, Jesus talks about how Moses raised a serpent up in the wilderness. And when the Jewish people needed to survive from, I think it was a snake bite, they'd look upon the serpent and they'd be healed. And then Jesus says, I think in the Gospel of John, just as Moses raised the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be raised up for the sins of the world. Right. So obviously in the Old Testament, they weren't viewing that as pointing to something in the New Testament. But retroactively, Jesus looks back on the Old Testament and says, no, that was pointing to me. Right. And so that's how typology works. Now, one of the worries that people have is typology seems to be too spurious as a method of interpretation. The problem with that view is simply that doesn't take into account what the audience of the New Testament were expecting, or even the context of the New Testament. So, for us today, like what we find convincing is a very nice and clear proof text, right? So we don't have to do too much exegetical work on our end. It's pretty clear, if Jesus says, I and the Father are one, we're all happy and we're like, yep, that's the beginnings of the Trinity right there, or something like that. Well, in the New Testament context, especially if you read the book, A Handbook to New Testament Exegesis by Craig L. Blomberg, he points out that in the ancient Mediterranean view of the world, of the Jews and even the Greeks and the Romans, they believed that the deity or God or whomever, that God, especially the Jewish people, they believed that God would repeat what he had done before so that his people could definitively know that the same God who's working, let's say, in Yeshua is the God who was working in Moses. And so they were expecting very clearly that there would be certain patterns and repetitions in history manifested before them so that they could know that the same God of their fathers is the same God acting now in supposedly this Yeshua who's claiming to be the Messiah, right? And so Craig Blomberg makes this point very clear in the Handbook to New Testament Exegesis. He also mentions it in his commentary on Matthew, in a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, where he says that this method, although, some people might view it as less persuasive, that's clearly not the case for the early Christian and Jewish audience of the New Testament. They were expecting typology. They were expecting repetition of the Old in the New Covenant. And so, some people have raised the objection, but then can't typology justify all kinds of crazy interpretations? Well, I'd ask them, give me an example, right? One that we would both agree is a crazy example. But, I remember Matt Fradd, when I was in his studio, he asked me to give an example of maybe a bad typology. And so I'll give you an example of a bad typology, right? So, in the book of Isaiah is taken up into the throne room of God, and there's thunder and lightning around the throne of God. In the New Testament, Jesus names two of his disciples, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother, the sons of thunder, right? And one of the reasons why is because later on, I think they were the ones in the Gospels who said they wished that that Jesus would, issue a firestorm upon some group of people, and then Jesus condemns them, and then he calls them the sons of thunder as kind of a playful name, right? If I'm remembering the details properly. Now, someone might say, well, that's a typology back to the book of Isaiah, when Isaiah visits the throne room of God and there's thunder and lightning. Well, the problem with that typology is that, you could make sense of the New Testament passage without any reference to that Old Testament passage. Because, for instance, Jesus is calling them sons of thunder because they were wanting God to issue down, this firestorm, right? And so you don't need the Old Testament passage in Isaiah to necessarily make sense of that. And so you can point to other examples, like, for instance, in other cases of typology, you generally speaking, if you don't have an explicit connection being made between the two types, you at least have numerous uncanny parallels, right? With respect to the parallel between, let's say, the thunder in Isaiah and the sons of thunder in the New Testament, the only resemblance is just one verbal resemblance of thunder, and that's it. But when I use examples of typology between, let's say, Eliakim and Peter, I don't have just one example. I have multiple examples to demonstrate why there would be a typology here. And the last thing is, too, generally speaking, typology is done to enhance a point about Jesus. So, for instance, when I make my case for Eliakim, I base this off of the messianic Davidic identity of Jesus, because Jesus was was foretold, right, to rebuild the Davidic monarchy, and that fits in really well with what I'm going to argue later in Matthew 16:19. In the case of the sons of thunder and thunder around the throne of God in Isaiah, there's nothing really typologically significant that a New Testament author would insert that for a particular reason. And so those are just some examples that I've come up with off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's really great. And I think another thing that I think you touched on in the beginning is that God isn't going to make something worse, so to say, in the New Testament that he did in the Old. So, like, one example might be with Adam. So we know explicitly that there's a typology between Jesus and Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And we can use that typology because you look at Jesus, he has essential similarities with Adam in terms of their significance in their respective parts of history. But Jesus fulfills everything everywhere Adam failed. And so it doesn't go the reverse. And so that's like one rule that I think is helpful is like, if Jesus is the new Adam or if Mary is the new Eve,
right,
then they're going to have all the quote unquote, I'll call them perfections or good things about them are going to be the significant ones are going to be the same or similar. But where one failed in the old covenant or in the Old Testament period, the fulfillment will kind of pick up where that person failed. So, this is with Mary as a new Eve. It's obvious that Mary, through her decision, brought life into the world and brought life to all men. But Eve, brought death to all men in some sense, or she's a part of that. And so Mary kind of has to pick up where Eve kind of left off or didn't do well, precisely because it's a fulfilling. It's not I don't want to call it a defilling, but it's not like getting worse,
Right. Yeah.
There's another rule I think is helpful.
Yeah, of course. And so what's interesting here too is that because of the identity of Jesus, you can actually start deriving other typologies around the people concerning the people around him, right? So, for instance, if Christ is the new Adam, then who's the new Eve, right? Or even in the Old Testament, right? God promises to Eve in Genesis chapter 3 that through your seed, will come the salvation of the world, and the head of the serpent will be crushed, right? And so, who then is going to fulfill that position of Eve then, like through her seed? So through whom, right? But I think the other compelling example is actually the Ark of the Covenant and the typology between that and Mary. So it's interesting, like in my debate with Gavin Ortland on Capturing Christianity, he actually told me that he was open to the typology between Mary and the Ark of the New Covenant, or the Ark of the Covenant. And to me, that typology is just so obvious in the New Testament. And so just to give you some examples of how typology works, right? In the Old Testament, when the Ark is recaptured, I think from the Philistines, it's brought to the hill countries of Judah and it stays there for 3 months, right? Or I think it's the hill countries of Judea, either one. But it stays in those hill countries for 3 months. When Mary visits Elizabeth, it says she stayed in the hill countries of Judah for 3 months, right? When Elizabeth sees the Blessed Mother, she says, "How is it the mother of my Lord has come to me?" When David sees the ark again after it's been recaptured, he says, "How is it that the ark of my Lord has come to me?" And then, he dances and he leaps with joy. And the same thing happens to John the Baptist. But I think the most telling parallel is that when in the Old Testament it says that God's Spirit overshadowed the ark, in the New Testament, when Mary begins her journey, it says, "And God overshadowed the Blessed Mother." He overshadowed Mary. And so the same exact Greek word used in the Old Testament, or the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew, they both use in the New Testament and Luke's Gospel, they both use the exact same Greek word to convey that God is overshadowing. In the Old Testament, it's the ark. In the New Testament, it's Mary. And so, that's why I mentioned the point about uncanny similarities. But then also you can get further, right, in the contents of the ark. So, inside the ark was it was the manna, the bread of life. It was the staff of Aaron, the symbol of the high priesthood, and then you had the Ten Commandments, the Word of God, right? Well, in the New Testament, what was inside Mary? The bread of life, our high priest, and the Word of God.
Yeah, and from there we can get into all sorts of things about like the Immaculate Conception and perpetual virginity,
or the Assumption. Yeah,
the Assumption as well in the Psalms. Yeah, that's another interesting point. And another thing that's interesting before we move on to the argumentation for the papacy is in the Old Testament, some of our Protestant friends might argue that, well, actually, Jesus's human body better fits the ark typology, but it can actually be both. It can actually be both, and so typology can be multifaceted, so long as the essential similarities and kind of in-depth meaning is there, or the embedded meaning is there. So a lot of people might not know the papal claims that the Vatican I Council makes. Very quickly, what are the core claims that the Vatican I Council made about the office of the Pope, or the papal office?
Yeah, so if you really wanted to boil it down into two things, it's that Christ gave a commission to Peter, right? And this commission was one of supreme and universal infallible authority over the entire church. So this is to say that Peter, in his declarations, would in effect be the final authority, right? So he had this capacity to be the final authority on doctrine concerning faith and morals. So he could, for instance, settle a dispute among the other apostles. He could speak on behalf of the entire church and speak the mind of the entire church in what we'd call like an ex cathedra fashion, from his own authority as the apostle, or the prince and the head of the apostles. And then he'd have authority over the entire church, meaning that he could hear appeals from the entire church. He could hear appeals from a church in Antioch, from an apostle in Antioch. If any of the churches needed his help, then he could be the first line of defense and the final word. And then so it's important then that also that when he makes a definitive declaration, right, we're saying that Peter would be infallible. He could not be errant in a definitive declaration binding the whole church. And so Vatican I is making the claim that Peter is this universal, infallible, supreme shepherd, and that this office of shepherd is handed to his successors in the Roman bishopric. So the bishops of Rome are the successors of Peter, and they possess this authority over the entire church, not because, they received it by canonical recognition. So it wasn't the case that some council gave Rome the authority and the bishops of Rome the authority to be supreme and universal. It was because the council is simply recognizing what was given to Peter by Christ 2,000 years ago. So Peter has a universal authority. It's immediate, meaning he doesn't have to go through anybody else. He can be the direct line of authority. He can directly give a declaration on faith and morals. It's infallible. And, he's the final he's the final word. So you can't appeal to anybody higher than the Bishop of Rome. And so these are the claims that are built into Vatican I.
And obviously, just to clarify for the audience as well, we wouldn't say that these claims were just invented at Vatican I. We would say that they're in church history and the scripture beforehand, but Vatican I just kind of clarified them.
Yeah, precisely. And even, I had an episode on my channel, Intellectual Conservatism, called Vatican I in the First Millennium. And I sat down with Michael Lofton, Eric Ybarra, and Elijah Yassi, and all three of them discussed three separate cases in church history where the claims of Vatican I were made in an ecumenical council or were accepted by a council from a pope himself declaring that he had these powers, right? And so it's not the case that the interpretation in Vatican I is a novel interpretation. It was there in church history. And so, this is just the Catholic Church in the First Vatican Council more neatly clarifying all the powers of the Pope and what's been going on throughout church history.
Awesome. And this is going to be my favorite part, because I love when you talk about this, is Catholics love Matthew 16, 18, 19, and 19. So how does that verse, or those two verses, get us the papal claims?
Yeah, good. So, I usually make two arguments for the papacy. One is John 21, 15 and 19, where Christ is making Peter shepherd and giving him this threefold commission: feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And so what's interesting is that, at least, I talk more about Matthew 16, 18, and 19, but the John 21 argument's actually really interesting as well. But let me just focus on Matthew for now. So in Matthew 16, 18, and 19, this is the famous confession at Caesarea Philippi, right? And so, you have this case in which Jesus is walking with his disciples. He asks them, who do you say that the Son of Man is, right? And so some of the apostles, they say, some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're a prophet. And then Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And then Peter rises up and he declares that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus then says of Peter, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And then he says, and so I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So it's interesting because in Matthew 16, 19, there's actually a very interesting Old Testament parallel, which is Isaiah 22, 22. So in the context of Isaiah 22, 22, there's a corrupt prime minister over Israel named Shebna, who is being replaced by a prime minister, or a new man named Eliakim, right? And so God says to Shebna, I'll take your tunic and girdle and I will give it to Eliakim. And then, God says, and I will give him the key of the house of David, and whatever he opens, no one will shut, and whatever he shuts, no one will open. So why do I think these are parallels? Well, the first reason why is because there's widespread recognition among scholars that Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16, 19 are parallels. Virtually every New Testament commentary today, and at least from the 1970s, has alluded or acknowledged this point. And so, for instance, Patrick Gray, in the 2017 Rutledge Guidebook to the New Testament, he states that it is generally acknowledged that the background for the metaphor of the keys here in Matthew 16, 19 is Isaiah 22, where a prime minister is deputized under the Davidic monarchy to be second in command to the king and issue binding decrees on his behalf. There are other books, like, for instance, R.T. France's Matthew, Evangelist and Teacher, I think published in the early 2000s, where he also states that it's generally recognized now the background for the metaphor of the keys is Isaiah 22, 22. And then Craig L. Blomberg, in a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, he explicitly states it is almost certain that the background metaphor for the keys here is Isaiah 22, 22. And moreover, in the 1970 New Bible Commentary, edited by Donald Guthrie and others, they also state that it is almost certain that the background metaphor for the keys in Matthew 16, 19 is Isaiah 22, 22. And so I've been looking through kind of also the reception in the church, and when did it become the case that this parallel was recognized? Insofar as I can tell, the earliest recognition of this parallel was during the Reformation, when Cardinal Cajetan was responding to Martin Luther and defending the authority of the Pope and the magisterium. So at least it goes back 500 years within church history. Now, some of the Orthodox have objected to, not seeing it earlier on in the history of the church. I have all sorts of responses to that. We can get to those later. But just to go into some more parallels between both of the passages. One is that both Matthew 16, 19 and Isaiah 22 have a similar structure. So God gives the keys of somebody's house, or in the case of the Davidic kingdom, to say the house of David is just to say David's kingdom or his palace. Someone receives keys, and with the exercise of these keys, they have definitive authority, right? So open and shutting. So if you open, no one's going to shut. If you shut, no one's going to open. Definitive, right? Well, in the case of Peter, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. When the Jewish people would talk about in heaven or the kingdom of heaven, they were really talking about the kingdom of God, or they're talking about in heaven before the presence of God. And so if God binds something, or if he looses something, then you better believe that there's nothing under the earth, under heaven, that can overrule the rulings of God, right? And so there's a common structure. In both passages, you also see a common theme going from corruption to purity. So in Isaiah 22, obviously a corrupt prime minister is being replaced with a good prime minister. In Caesarea Philippi, there was a giant rock dedicated to pagan worship of the deity Pan and Caesar Augustus, hence why the area is called Caesarea Philippi. It was dedicated by Philip the Tetrarch, the son of Herod, to Caesar Augustus to worship his identity. And we also know that around this rock, there was a stream that led into the gates of the netherworld. And then Jesus says, the gates of hell, or in some translations, the gates of the netherworld will not prevail against you. And so even the Protestant New Testament scholar Ben Witherington III, in his Smith and Helleu's study of the commentary on Matthew, he points out that this is part of the background of what's going on. The reason why Jesus is mentioning, the gates of the netherworld, why the context is so important is precisely because here in the New Testament, Jesus is declaring, so to speak, war on the pagan powers. And he's saying, no, my rock, the rock of my temple is going to triumph, not the pagan rock, the corrupt pagan sources, right? And so you have this theme once again of going from corruption to purity. In Isaiah 22, I believe it is verse 25, it describes how Eliakim is a firm peg. And so Eliakim is compared to a firm, reliable object. Well, in the New Testament, Peter is called rock. That's literally what it means to be Peter or Petros in the New Testament. And so both Peter and Eliakim are compared to reliable objects. Now, someone might object at this point, well, but we do know that, Isaiah says that one day the firm peg of Eliakim will give way, presumably during the siege of Jerusalem under the Assyrians, not the Babylonians. Well, what's interesting there is that in the New Testament, when Peter's compared to a rock, we know that in Jewish metaphor, if you're calling someone a rock or you're comparing someone to a rock, that it means an everlasting, reliable foundation. So, for instance, the Jerusalem temple was built on a rock, and literally this rock had keys inside of it where you would have to get the keys from the rock in order to open the temple or shut the temple, right? So, I mean, the parallels are just incredible here. And the Jews believed that this rock had existed from the beginning of creation. This was the same rock that Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac on. And this rock was therefore the symbol of unity and everlasting, everlasting reality for the Jewish people. And so my point here is that this same metaphor is applied to Peter, and therefore we have a non-ad hoc symmetry breaker for why the firm peg of Eliakim that gives way will not give way in the case of Peter because he's the rock. But nonetheless, both of them are likened to objects. I can think of other examples to kind of back up the parallel here. So, for instance, another example is that when Eliakim receives his keys, he receives his keys before the destruction of Jerusalem under the king Hezekiah. Now, in the New Testament, Peter also receives his keys before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so the point that I want to make here is that we also have some uncanny kind of apocalyptic themes that are being repeated here. And so I can go on and on with more parallels and examples, but I think this sufficiently demonstrates that this is the last point I'll make. The last point I'll make is that in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when I believe it's Nathan, reveals to David that his kingdom will last forever through one of his sons. And then we learn in Luke chapter 1, verse 32 to 35, that Jesus is this son of David and son of God who will establish the Davidic throne forever. And so it's fully consistent with what's going on in the identity of Jesus, that Jesus would be rebuilding the Davidic monarchy and instituting a prime minister. And we also know in the Gospel of Luke that when Jesus reveals in the synagogue that he's the Messiah, he cites from the book of Isaiah. And so here in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus' messianic identity is revealed, it would make total sense that he would cite again from the book of Isaiah. And so we have numerous biblical and historical parallels to show that we have a real valid typology here.
Awesome. And before we move on, because I want to get into the powers of Eliakim's office and how that's kind of fulfilled in the new, but I want to maybe make two quick objections that our Protestant and even Orthodox friends might make. One is that the key in Isaiah 22 is a singular, and in Matthew 16 it's a plural, and that in Revelation I think it's 3:7.
Right.
It says Jesus has the key. So you'd have a better typology between Revelation 3 and Isaiah 22. And then the second objection is from their perspective, we can foresee how you're going to get infallibility out of this, Swan, because, Peter's the rock, and the church or the gates of hell won't prevail against the rock, and the rock is Peter. But isn't there a distinction between Petros and Petra? Jesus calls Peter Petros, but he calls the rock on which the church is built Petra, which means like a small rock or a foundation stone. So how do you make sense of those two objections and respond to them?
Yeah, so I'll respond to the latter, and then I'll go to the former. So the objection of Petros and Petra has largely been disregarded by New Testament scholars today as an invalid objection. The reason why is because one of the reasons why is because in Craig S. Keener's 1993 commentary on Matthew, although he created a 2011 reprint of it, it was acknowledged that by Jesus' day in Greek, Petros and Petra were interchangeable. So during the time of Jesus, there would have been no real distinction between Petros and Petra. Moreover, we know that if Jesus made the declaration to Peter in Aramaic, it would have been Kepha, Kepha. So Jesus would have been saying, thou art Kepha, and upon this Kepha I will build my church. At that point, then you couldn't miss the pun that Jesus was making on Peter's name. Some other examples that you can use is the fact that Leander E. Keck and even Michael J. Wilkins, so Keck in his New Interpreter's Bible Commentary and Michael J. Wilkins in the NIV Application Commentary, they both point out that in the original language, even if it's Aramaic or if it's Greek or if it's Hebrew, whatever language Jesus spoke, for our English ears, the sentence should be read like this: you are rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. And so when we read in English, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, we think they're, two separate things, right? But that's completely not the case. Moreover, in D.A. Carson's 1984 Expositor's Bible Commentary, he points out that if the Protestant interpretation or the traditional Protestant interpretation were correct, that Petros and Petra, that Peter and the rock of the church are two separate things, Jesus would have actually used a different Greek word, and we know what Greek word he would have used. He would have used lithos, which means a stone of any size. But the fact that Jesus, at least in the Greek, uses Petros and Petra, he's using two words that are interchangeable, right? Now, the reason why the two words are different is because Peter is a man, whereas, if you use rock as a general metaphor, sometimes certain objects in Greek are given the feminine gender, and it's just kind of a randomly assigned thing. So the point I'm making here is that it's been recognized by scholars at least since the 1970s. So, for instance, in Charles Talbert's 2010 commentary on Matthew, he points out that at least in 1976 with Charles Burgess, the general consensus of scholars has been that the rock of Matthew 16:18 is Peter, and not his faith or not his confession. It's going back to the person of Peter himself. And so I can use all sorts of different examples here, but Petros and Petra is no longer a viable objection to Peter being the rock. That is to say, the person of Peter being the rock of Matthew 16:18. But even more recently, research that's been done on the Dead Sea Scrolls and rabbinic midrash. Midrash means rabbinic commentary on the scriptures. They pointed out that the Jewish people viewed Abraham as the rock on which God built the nation of Israel. In Isaiah chapter, I believe it's 51, 1-2, God says, look to the rock from which you were hewn and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and Sarah, your mother, right? So Abraham in the book of Isaiah is identified as the rock of Israel. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Thanksgiving hymn, that the image of rocks were used as foundations for entire communities. And then we know in the Avraham Petra Midrash, remember the rabbinic commentary, that the rabbis viewed Abraham as the rock on which God had built Israel. And so if that's the case, then we see already in the Jewish mindset and the Jewish context of what Jesus is saying, they wouldn't have missed the fact that the person of Peter is the rock of Matthew 16:18. Now, when it comes to Revelation 3:7 and other passages, I think the first thing that's important to point out is that you can have a type repeated in multiple ways, right? So, for instance, some people have objected, well, Peter can't be the rock because Christ is the cornerstone. Or Ephesians says that the apostles are the cornerstone or the foundation stones on which the church is built, right? It's built on the foundation of the apostles. Well, D.A. Carson, remember, a Protestant New Testament scholar, he responds to this objection by saying typology can be applied in multiple flexible ways. You have to look at the immediate context in order to understand what's going on. And so, yeah, Christ can be the cornerstone and Peter can be the rock on which Christ built the church, right? That's totally fine if you understand the immediate context of what these passages are saying. But I mean, as other people have pointed out, like I think it's Vincent R. Martin in his commentary on the word studies of the Gospels, I think in the Gospel of Matthew, he points out that, here in Matthew, Jesus is being portrayed as the architect, right? And so it would make more sense that Peter would be the rock of the church and Christ is the one building on top of Peter, so to speak. Whereas in other passages, Christ is referred to as the cornerstone because there's no reference to an architect or something like that. So Christ becomes the cornerstone of those passages. The second thing is that it's not inconsistent with even Davidic monarchical customs that both the prime minister and the king would have the key to the house of David. I mean, because if you have the key to the house of David, right, if you're the king, that's your house. So, of course, you are the one who gives the keys to the prime minister, right? And so it wouldn't be problematic if both the prime minister and the king had the keys to the house of David. That's not a problem. And so Jesus having the keys to the house of David in the New Testament, that's not a problem either. But the thing is that Jesus is the Davidic king. He's not the Davidic prime minister. Whereas in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus's Davidic lineage and kingship is emphasized so much, it makes sense then to have the king giving a prime minister the key to the house of David. And, some people bring up the difference between key and keys. And once again, this is not a relevant or, significant difference, right? I mean, so one possibility is that simply, not much hinges on actually the fact that it's plural versus singular. So for instance, if I say like, Suan, do you have your car keys, right? Yeah, I do. So I pull out my car keys, right? And actually my car keys are right here. Now, technically speaking, there's only one key to get into my car. But as a matter of convention, we just say car keys, even though there's just one key, right? And so that could be something that's going on in the New Testament. The other possibility is that because Jesus is king over the house of David and the kingdom of heaven, he gives Peter two keys. And actually, in the historic representation and paintings that have been done on Peter receiving the keys, it's typically been two keys, at least, that have been given to Peter. Sometimes it's just one key, right? But sometimes it's two as well. Because you have the kingdom of David and the kingdom of heaven being brought together in one reality in the person of Christ. And so because Peter is making declarations, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, he's got two kingdoms now, not just one.
Awesome. And another quick thing, I know I have this a little bit later down on the list, but maybe we could get it out of the way because I think it's become more relevant to this particular part of the show. Is many will argue, okay, Suan, so we'll grant that Peter is the new Eliakim and that he's the new prime minister of the new Davidic kingdom, which is both spiritual and visible in significant ways that it was in the Old Testament. But if you go to Matthew 18, the other apostles are given the authority to bind and loose. And in another passage, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, but I might be wrong, or in Ephesians, I don't know why I'm thinking both, it calls the apostles stones or rocks on which the church is built. So
right.
Couldn't you make this same argument that you're going to get into with infallibility and universal jurisdiction in a minute? Couldn't you use that same argument for the other apostles? And so you have multiple popes.
Yeah, good. So this is kind of like a little bit like the Orthodox objections that I've heard to this translation. But first, I think one thing to point out is that what happens in Matthew 16 is unique. And even though Matthew 18:18, all the apostles received the power to bind and loose, I mean, the Greek that is used there is himos, which means you all in the plural. Whereas in the case of Peter receives the promise to that whatever he binds on earth shall be bound in heaven, singularly and directly from Christ himself, right? And so the point here is that, if Peter were just like any other apostle, then why would Jesus say that he has the power to bind and loose, in this particular passage where it's very much about Peter, his name being changed and so on and so forth, right? So why would that be the case? So, for instance, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison, in their international critical commentary on Matthew, they point out that even though all the apostles, along with Peter, have the power to bind and loose, they have the power, to declare halakha or interpret the scriptures and discipline the community. They point out that still, what happens in Matthew 16 to 17, and so on and so forth, these are things that can only be said of Peter, right? So Peter's name is exclusively and uniquely changed into rock. So there's something unique going on with Peter. And even still, when Jesus, asked for his identity, and Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," other people have pointed out that Jesus then parallels what Peter is saying, and he says, and you are Peter. So just as Peter said, "You are the Christ," Jesus says, "Then you are Peter, and upon this rock," right? So in both instances, the deeper identity of the person is being revealed in a very unique and exclusive sense. And then, moreover, in the case of Matthew 16:19, if it were not for the keys and binding and loosing, then we would have never picked up the parallel with Isaiah 22, right? So, for instance, if Jesus just said, "Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven," there's not much to go off of with a parallel to Isaiah 22. But because Jesus mentions the keys explicitly with Peter, we get a unique reference back to the book of Isaiah with a parallel to this prime minister being given keys and this definitive exercise of his power, right? And so the point that I'm making is that in Matthew 18:18, you only have the power to bind and loose, right? But you don't get that unique Isaiah 22:22 parallel. You precisely need the keys in order to have that parallel, which can only happen with Peter. But moreover, we know that in the New Testament, Jesus is rebuilding the Davidic monarchy. And in the case of a prime ministerial figure, the keys would naturally only belong to one person, right? And so Peter is the best candidate for the person who has the keys in a unique sense as the prime minister. Now, what I would argue then is that in other places where images that are applied to Peter are repeated, it's not, I think it's a bit sloppy to say that means that, all of them have the keys now, or all of them are rocks like Peter, right? I think certainly there's a similarity being drawn. The argument that I'd make is that what's going on is that there's a participation in the ministry of Peter himself. And so I can use multiple, avenues and defenses of this. So one thing to point out is that in the Acts 15 council, which we'll get to later, Peter says that the Lord said that it would be by my mouth that the Gentiles would enter the kingdom of God, that they would enter into the church, right? And so what Peter is in effect saying is that all you other apostles in this council, you're actually participating in my mission to open the church to the Gentiles, right? And so in that sense, the apostles in communion with Peter, they use their binding and loosing power to open up the church to all of the Gentiles. Another example that I like using is that, in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, so this is more for our Orthodox friends, but even our Protestant friends can benefit from it. God calls Israel a holy nation of priests, right? And then in the New Testament, Peter refers to the believers as, a holy priesthood. And so as Catholics and Orthodox, we know that when Peter is talking about the universal priesthood, that doesn't mean that collapses into just an egalitarian system where there's no institutional priesthood. What it means is that in a unique sense, we are priests, right? But there's still that institutional, more formal, concentrated way in which the priesthood still exists. And likewise in the Old Testament, right? Like God, calls Israel a holy nation of priests. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an institutional, unique, more solemn sense in which there was a priesthood. And so my argument here would be that whenever things that are said of the person of Peter are expanded and applied to other people in a group setting, this is really God saying that all these other people are participating in the ministry of Peter, but that doesn't mean that it has to be an egalitarian participation where everyone is a Peter, everyone's on the same level, right? So I would say that Peter is a type for all bishops, but not all bishops are Peter. That's the argument that I'd use in reverse.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. And before we move on, I think that was an awesome response, because it really does seem like when you read Matthew, although it is true in Catholic theology, our saints, and even I think maybe the Catechism, I'm not sure, they do talk about the other apostles receiving the keys in a different sense. But it's interesting to me that Matthew doesn't say that. Matthew specifically doesn't say that the other apostles were given the keys. It just says they were given the binding and loosing. So Peter is really singled out. His name is the only one that's changed and things like that. And I think that really gives us a primacy of Peter, and with in conjunction with the other things that we're about to get into, a supremacy of Peter. So that's really interesting.
And with Matthew 18, that specifically concerns church discipline. And so all you really need actually is just binding and loosing, because the rabbinic terminology would totally fit and make sense there, right? And so you don't need the keys in Matthew 18:18 to make sense of what's going on in the passage, right? But if Jesus is going to use the keys in Matthew 16:19, then it has to be for a unique and distinct reason. Because if Peter just has an authority like all the other apostles, then why didn't Jesus just say, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven? Why did he have to put in the keys, right? But it's precisely because he puts in the keys that there's something unique going on in Matthew 16:19 and not in 18:18, because 18:18 can be made sense of without reference to the keys. And so you can have that clean distinction without any loss to meaning in both passages.
Yeah, and one more thing I'll point out for maybe our Orthodox friends is Saint Optatus of Milevis, I believe. I don't know how to pronounce it, Milevis or Milevis. He actually states that in his book, I believe, Against the Donatists, he says that Peter alone received the keys to the kingdom, but then the other apostles received it through Peter. And so that's what we would say. And so I love that point you made about the holy, the nation of priests. I actually never thought of that. Is it doesn't diminish the hierarchy is maintained,
right?
And it's kind of a participation, and that's very similar to metaphysics, actually, which is
yeah, which is a nice point to make. And as I've heard some Protestants make the objection, well, Jesus is only God talks about how Jesus talks about how only the Messiah is the true teacher, right? And we would agree, right? Or for instance, when Jesus says, call no man father, especially for us Orthodox and Catholics, we have to make sense of that, right? But then notice that Jesus says only your Father in heaven is the one that you should call Father, right? In this context of a religious setting. But then the idea is that the reason why we can call our priests Father is because they are participating in the fatherhood of God. They're participating in the ministry of Christ, right? And so, technically speaking, there's only one priest. There's only one Father, and that is God. But because of the ministry of Christ and how he spread, the powers of the church, other people can participate in that ministry, but only in a hierarchical sense, right? And so I would say that there's no problem with what we've been saying here as Catholics, that Peter is a type for all bishops, but not all bishops are Peter. We can find multiple examples in the New Testament where, Jesus says that only God is your Father. But then why do we call other men Father? Well, because they're participating in the ministry of God, and hence that's why Paul says that he can become a father to other members of the church through Jesus Christ.
Awesome. And so what is we talked about this office in the Old Testament that Eliakim is given. What are the powers that Eliakim is actually given here? And what, how do we get, because it doesn't say in Isaiah 22 what the powers are, at least exhaustively.
Right.
So what are the powers, and how do we know what the powers are? And how does that relate to Peter?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. There's been a lot of historical work that's been done on the office of prime minister in the Old Testament. Typically speaking, it's called the chief steward, right? That's another name that it can go by. And so there's a book called, In Service of the King by Nili Sasher Fox. There's also Roland DeVoe's book, Ancient Israel, Its Life and Institutions. And there is, I think it's Bruce Mettinger's book, excuse me, or it's J.D. Mettinger's book, Solomonic State Officials, right? So in these particular works, they talk about the powers of the chief steward, right? And one of these powers is that he's second in command to the king. Sasher Fox disagrees with that, but DeVoe and and Mettinger, they agree with this point. So regardless, he's the highest official in the state of Israel under the king. Some people would say he's second in command to the king. And moreover, DeVoe points out that in Genesis chapter 40 and even in verse 4 in chapter 44, when Pharaoh makes Joseph, prime minister over Israel, he says that he made him in charge of his house. And so in the ancient Near East, a lot of the kings would have this office of chief steward, one who was over the house, right? And this person who was over the house was second in command to the king. He could command the army. He could even rule over the entire kingdom when the king was incapacitated. So, for instance, in the case of, I'm trying to remember his name, Jotham. In the case of Jotham in the Old Testament, when the king is incapacitated, I believe it's King Obadiah, he actually becomes king over Israel to cover up for or to compensate for the king's inavailability. And so the prime minister was always second in command and willing and ready to take over the kingdom if it became necessary. And so this king also had, this prime minister also had authority over all the king's possessions. So, for instance, the house of David is sometimes translated as the palace of David. And we know that in order to get into the palace, you had to have keys. And so the keys in ancient Israel were not these small little handheld keys. More accurate translations of Isaiah 22 say that Eliakim receives the key of the house of David on his shoulder, right? And so, you would have to hold the key on your shoulder and in your hands at the same time because these were massive. And as Keener points out in his IBP background New Testament commentary, the size of these keys indicate the authority of the prime minister. They show that he is the one who can open and shut the gates of the palace. He decides when the royal day begins. In the case of ancient Egypt, this person who was over the house of the pharaoh, of the king, he would decide when the day would begin. He would decide what the officials could do. Every other official was under his command. And every document received his seal of approval. And so literally there was a central chain of command where all the other provinces and kingdoms had to go through at least him as the center of unity for his approval. And, we also know that in Solomon's kingdom, that Solomon had 12 smaller stewards or governors over Israel. So there were these local stewards, and you can think of them as kind of like types for bishops. But that didn't take away from the fact that there was one universal steward over the entire kingdom of Israel. And now some people have raised the objection, but why then would Israel model itself after Egypt? Why would they have this power? Why would the office of Joseph carry over into into Israel? One point that I'd emphasize, and this is something that other people have mentioned to me, is that Israel, remember when they wanted a king, they said they wanted to be like every other nation around them. Well, every other nation around them, as we know from the archaeological record, had a king of some sort, and he also had a prime minister of some sort, right? The second thing is that one of the evidences or proofs that we have that the Israelites were once in Egypt is because they continued doing things and writing about things that only someone in Egypt would have known. And so the fact that they would have modeled their monarchy after the office of the pharaoh is exactly what we would expect if they were once in Egypt themselves. And so there are all these different examples that point to the historical reliability of the parallel between the Davidic prime minister and the office of Joseph, where Joseph was second in command to the king. He had universal power over all of Egypt. And then we can say, if this is the backdrop for the Old Testament, or excuse me, the Old Testament backdrop for the New Testament keys and the office of prime minister, then that actually kind of lines up pretty well with Vatican I.
And so it would be correct to say that whoever had the role of Eliakim in the Old Testament, being the prime minister or the chief steward, it'd be correct to say that he was the center of unity, or at least his office was the center of unity for the kingdom. And it'd be correct.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. So yeah, in an administrative sense, yes, he was the center of unity aside from the king himself. As I mentioned before, at least in Egypt, right, the vizier, this is the other name for the chief steward in Egypt, the vizier, he would have his seal on all royal documents. All officials were under his commands. And, the king would delegate whatever, he needed him to do. All that would go through the vizier's hand. And so, he would be a kind of center of unity. The other point I wanted to mention, too, is that the prime minister in Israel, but even in Egypt, they would always operate from a central, I should only say from Israel. In the case of Israel, specifically mentioned by Neely Sasher Fox, her book, In Service of the King, she points out that this prime minister would always operate from a capital city in the kingdom, right? And so in the New Testament, aside from Jerusalem, right, what is the one city that the Jews believed that when the Messiah would come, he would conquer that city? It was Rome, right? And so I would make the argument that Peter dying in Rome and the prime ministerial office being continued in Rome makes total and perfect sense. Because, the old kingdom is there in Jerusalem, and now it continues into the new covenant, into the new kingdom, expanding to the Gentiles and to the entire world through this capital city, Rome, that had access to the entire Mediterranean world.
And so Eliakim, I know you mentioned that there was 12 in Solomon's kingdom. There were 12 kind of people with authority under him.
Right.
Could Eliakim, since he essentially, for all intents and purposes, he is the king's, steward. He in a sense, we could talk about him being the king, right? Could he?
Well, he could be the vicar of the king, like the representative of the king, because he would make binding decisions on his behalf. And Eliakim served under King Hezekiah. But the point that I was making is that Solomon started the 12 stewardships or governorships over Israel. But the point is that even in later Davidic kingdoms, kingdoms that are through the sons of David, right? You would have the 12 Solomonic governors or the 12 stewards, but that wouldn't take away from the fact that there was still one universal steward over all of Israel.
And so Eliakim could just kick those guys out if he saw fit out of those offices.
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's really rare. And this is the other thing to point out, too, in ancient Israel, right? And this is, so Sasha Fox, I read her work on this, and she rejects the idea that Eliakim was second in command to the king. I disagree with her. And the reason why is because, one, she rejects the parallel between between Joseph in Egypt and the office of prime minister in Israel, because she doesn't think the story of Joseph happened, but I think it really did happen. And so I have a reason to affirm them the parallel, which is that Joseph's office was the model or type for the prime ministerial office. The second thing is that, typically speaking, when you have a functional, stable kingdom, you don't have to have the prime minister kicking people out of their office, right? But in times of crisis or division in the kingdom, or when the kingdom was under attack, this is when you would especially see the prime minister reach his height of power. So, for instance, like when the king is incapacitated, Jotham, the steward under, I think, King Obadiah, he becomes the king over Israel because he's the second in command, so to speak. When the generals during the siege of Jerusalem under the Assyrians, when the generals are incapacitated or they're killed, we don't know exactly what happened to them. Eliakim assumes command of the army, and so basically speaking, wherever there was an office that was incompetent or unable to serve, the prime minister could immediately fill that role, and he could cross administrative boundaries. Sasha Fox will admit at least that much, that the prime minister could transcend his own office and rule through other offices at the same time.
And that's very similar. So it'd be very rare, but still possible.
It's still possible. It's within the power of the prime minister and it's interesting that people would think that at least in ancient Israel, the prime minister had the right to do that. Well, the reason why he had the right to do that is because he had the keys over all the king's property. And so he had property, he had ownership, so to speak, over all the other offices as well that depended upon the king's property. And so he had this capacity. It's kind of like today, the king obviously had real administrative duties, but a lot of the nitty gritty kind of, bureaucratic stuff would go through the prime minister. And so that's why he'd be the natural fit to take command of an office if the king was too busy or if the king was incapacitated some way.
All right. Awesome. And just for people who might not have connected the dots yet, how does this give us the Vatican I papacy? Would we say those roles of Eliakim, or those powers are paralleled with Peter?
Yeah. So what I would say is, the reason why we get to the Vatican I papacy is because in the New Testament, Christ as the son of David is rebuilding his father's kingdom. And it was the custom of the sons of David to have a prime minister serving under them second in command. And this particular prime minister, because he had the keys to the house of David, he could open and shut the kingdom to whomever he thought fit. And so we see that Peter in the Acts 15 council, he declares that it's by his mouth that the Gentiles will enter the church. or the house of God. And so in that case, then Peter is acting in that prime ministerial Eliakim-like role. But in other cases throughout church history, we've seen cases where the Pope had to challenge a bishop, where the Pope had to excommunicate a bishop, where the Pope had to discipline the church. And this is exactly within the powers of the prime minister in the Old Testament, where he could also assume the office of other officials if they were not being competent or if they were just incapacitated. This prime minister had universal and immediate direct jurisdiction over the kingdom of Israel. I think the same would hold true in the case of the new Israel in the New Testament under the Son of David, that is Jesus Christ. And there are all sorts of other examples that we can give, but I think it's pretty clear then how we get to an office that is supreme or final, because, and even in the New Bible commentary by Donald Guthrie and other editors, they point out that whoever could open and shut, in this way that's described in Isaiah 22, no one under him except the king could undo his rulings. And so this would literally be something like an ex cathedra power being given to a prime minister in the Old Testament. And so it would naturally carry over into the New Testament under the Davidic kingdom. And I've heard all kinds of objections to this sort of parallel. And I think it really has to do with what you think is the relationship between the church and Israel. Some of the Orthodox have objected that, well, the reason why the parallel doesn't carry over is because the church is not a nation. But then Peter calls the church a holy nation, a priest. The same thing that was described of Israel in the Old Testament. The city of Zion, Israel, is also called a holy nation, a priest. And so we are still that same nation. We are still continuing on the legacy of David through his son. And so I see no reason why the kingdom wouldn't continue on in perfect continual succession.
Yeah, and that's weird coming from an Orthodox person, because they would actually affirm that the church, in other conversations, that the church is the new Israel. So it's weird that they would make that objection, because
they would say like it's a spiritual kind of Israel, right? But not like a national kind of Israel, like in the same way that Israel once was. And so to some extent that's true, right? And so in the New Testament, then you kind of get a baptized or Christianized version of these offices, right? But I don't see why the universal aspect wouldn't carry over of the prime ministerial office, especially with some of the examples that I've used about the primacy of Peter or how he acts in the New Testament. And we can go into some of these examples. But the point that I'm making here is that just because we're going from, let's say, a more earthly kingdom or a secular temporal kingdom, well, even then still too, that's not really true, because Israel wasn't a secular kingdom. The religion and the state were so close together, just as in the New Covenant, the relationship between the earthly church and the bishops and heaven are so close together. So I don't know if I like that distinction at all. But the point is that I don't see how the transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant would mean that we wouldn't have a universal prime minister. That doesn't seem to follow.
It seems like one of those essential features of Old Testament Israel, that there was a king and a vicar of a king.
Right.
And so in the New Testament, why would we expect those essential similarities to just go away, especially with all the typological evidence you've given us from Matthew 16 itself?
Yep. I agree.
So really quick, because I want to get into the Council of Acts 15 and things like that a little bit more in John 21 and Luke 22. But was the office of Eliakim a successional office? Just, what was it, a successional office? Because I remember Gavin Ortland brought up this point is, do we know if Eliakim himself had successors? And was this office successional? And if not, doesn't that kind of break the typology? Because we would say it's Peter and his successors.
Yeah, so the interesting thing here is that the office of prime minister in the Old Testament was successional by nature. So we know that before Eliakim, there was Jotham, Ahishar, and several other prime ministers. I believe there were 3 or 4 before him. And so we have their names in the Old Testament. The other thing to point out as well is that Eliakim's office does end once the Assyrians attack Jerusalem. And so some people say, that means that then Peter's office doesn't continue, right? And remember when I said that we have a non-ad hoc symmetry breaker between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Because even though Peter and Eliakim are both compared to reliable objects, Eliakim is compared to a firm but collapsible peg. Peter is compared to a rock. In Jewish tradition, rocks are everlasting. They don't die. They don't go away. They're there forever. And so my point here then is that Peter is, Peter's office of prime minister is intrinsically or by nature successional. And then we know it doesn't die with him because he's not the firm but collapsible peg. He's the rock of the church, and rocks are meant to last forever. And so that's how I get around that objection.
And the gates, we could add in that the gates of hell won't prevail against this rock. So it's like an opposite of the firm peg giving way.
Right. Good. That's a good point to make as well. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So another kind of Orthodox style objection, and then we'll get into the other passages that are in themselves interesting, and we could do a whole show on them, is why the successors of Peter in Rome? Because there were successors of Peter, in a sense, in other sees, and Orthodox would say, all sees have successors of Peter kind of ruling them or within their jurisdiction. So why specifically the successors of Peter in Rome rather than, in Antioch or something? I know we went over this a little bit earlier or touched on it with the kind of the city having a role to play in the unity.
Right, yeah.
But maybe develop that a little bit.
I mean, so the reason why I'd say it's Rome in particular is because Rome was the hotbed for messianic expectations. So if the Messiah was going to conquer any city, then it was going to be Rome, right? And so one then is that I would make the argument from messianic expectations that Rome seems to be the principal place. The second thing is that the prime minister in the Old Testament always operated from a capital city. And so that at least narrows us down to Jerusalem or Rome as being the two main cities, at least in the New Testament context. Now, the reason why I don't think it's Jerusalem anymore is because Jerusalem was the capital city of the Old Covenant. But then with the entrance of the Gentiles, we now have to include, the entire world, so to speak. And so it's fitting that Rome would be the new capital city for precisely this reason. It had access to the rest of the Mediterranean world, and it had access to both Gentile and Jewish Christians as well. When it comes to the case of Jerusalem, I'd also say that the fact that the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD by a prophecy of Christ is, I think that's symbolic of the fact that the old way of Judaism had kind of come to an end. Because before the temple was destroyed, the temple was viewed as the central place of Judaism, the central place of worship, right? But then Jesus, says that his body is greater than the temple, right? He talks about how his body is the temple, and how exactly when he talks about how the temple will be destroyed and in 3 days it will rise again, right? He's talking about his own body. And so obviously then we're moving on beyond Jerusalem, and we're moving now into a new capital city, into new terrain for the Christian church. We're spreading now the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob into the entire world. And so Rome is that principal place. And I'd also say that we know that Peter died in Rome alongside Paul. And then we also know throughout church history, multiple people have claimed, especially Pope Leo, that Rome is the place in which they have the most unique claim to Petrine succession. Because we know that there in Rome, Peter ordained certain men to be his successors in the episcopate. Of course, he did this in Antioch, and I believe some would claim Alexandria, right? But when you combine all of these reasons together, I think it's clear why Rome would be the unique place to claim unique Petrine lineage, and notwithstanding the fact that his body is there as well.
Yeah, and even Orthodox, I think, would have to concede that, even though it's not the same kind of primacy, there was a certain sense in which the Bishop of Rome was like preeminent in terms of his Petrine succession. It wasn't Vatican I, at least for the Orthodox, they don't think that. But there was a kind of unique succession in Rome to Peter. Obviously, they wouldn't say it's Vatican I, but they would say it's a kind of primacy. So I don't think this is really a point that, about, isn't everyone a successor of Peter? I think everyone has to recognize Rome had a unique claim to that succession, at least in terms of its bishops.
Yeah, and I'd also say too that the only times in church history where it has been claimed that Peter has spoken through someone, at least in the first millennium, was only through the bishops of Rome. It was never claimed of any other bishop that Peter spoke through them directly.
And lives on and judges them as well.
Right,
I think
exactly.
Ephesus says that. And that's an insane claim by itself in a good way.
Yeah.
So I would say that there doesn't need to be as big a divide on that. um, with the Orthodox. And also, just one more point is the the See of Rome was very particularly called the See of Peter. Generally, you know, Antioch was not called the See of Peter in the way that Rome was called that by the early church. So again, it's just like the early church kind of knew Rome had a unique place, and even Orthodox don't have to disagree with that in principle. It's just about how far we go. And I think your argument with Eliakim solidifies how far we go.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I have actually maybe 5 or 6 more minutes left before I have to go on another channel to do another interview. And so just ask me maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I was just about to wrap it up with objection with Acts 15. And how do you think Luke 22, you kind of already covered John 21. How does Luke 22 and play into the papal view that we have? And what's the objection from Acts 15? How do you respond to it as quickly as you can?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to Acts chapter 15, this is the Council of Jerusalem. Also, you know, when you said like you try to do it as quickly as you can, the funny thing is that when you get me started, I can't stop. And so this might actually take a bit long. So it's okay. You know, it's on me, right? So if I show up late to the next interview, then that's my fault. Don't worry about anything. So when it comes to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, this is the famous council where in Jerusalem, the brothers began disputing about whether or not the Gentiles had to be circumcised and, you know, follow the other traditions of Moses. And so here, you know, eventually a debate arises and Paul and Barnabas get involved. And then it says, I believe it's Acts 15, in the earlier verses before verse 7, it talks about how the most important men in Jerusalem and in the church appeared. And so you get into Acts 15 now, and Peter, you know, it says, after much debate, Peter stood up and he declared before the whole assembly, the Lord has chosen that it would be by my mouth that the church will be open to the Gentiles. And then Peter says at the end of his speech, and he says, and we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, not by circumcision. So notice that in this council, Peter is saying everybody else is participating in my mission to open the church. And then at the very end of his speech, he speaks on behalf of the entire church universal. He declares the gospel before everybody. He says, we believe. Notice that he's speaking on behalf of the entire church. We believe that we are saved by faith through grace in Jesus Christ, and so on and so forth, right? And so after that, Paul and Barnabas continue speaking, and it's interesting that Luke does not record what Paul or Barnabas is saying. I guess he didn't view it as important, perhaps, or something like that. And then when we get down to James, as the bishop of Jerusalem, he reiterates what Peter says, and he is in agreement or in communion, so to speak, if you want to say it like that, with Peter. And then he says, and therefore I make the judgment. And so now James is making the judgment over his diocese that they will accept, you know, that you don't have to be circumcised. The Gentiles don't have to be circumcised in order to enter the kingdom of heaven and be part of the church. Now, some people raise the objection, well, if Peter was speaking ex-Catholic, you know, Peter is the Pope, if he's the prime minister, if Vatican I is true, then why did James have to make the final ruling? Well, one is that Peter doesn't have to use his prime ministerial powers if, like, the other person is already agreeing with him, if the other person is already coinciding with his judgment. That seems kind of unnecessary, at least, you know, that seems unnecessary that he'd have to be like, oh, no, but actually it's my judgment, right? It's like, no, well, James is in communion with me. He agrees with my judgment. I just spoke on behalf of the entire church. So yeah, there's no issue there to be had. I mean, and the second thing too is that, you know, some Orthodox raise the objection, well, if the Pope has this power, you know, to make ex-cathedra declarations, then why do we have ecumenical councils, right? Well, the reason why we have ecumenical councils is because if later on a bishop defects, we have the soft power, so to speak, to be able to pull up that he agreed on paper, on the documents and the canons of the council, that he accepted and assented to its teaching, right? And so there's a soft power, so to speak, to be had in having another bishop rather than being, you know, forced to by an ex-cathedra declaration, just simply agreeing with you. The other thing is too is that when the Pope declares something ex-cathedra, he is not speaking against the church, but he's speaking on behalf of the entire church. And so we already see that in Acts chapter 15 with Peter declaring the faith of the church before everybody. But also, um, you know, when the Pope later on in history makes ex cathedra declarations, he first looks and sees and consults his brother bishops. Hey, is this the faith of the church? Oh, and if it is, then I will use my apostolic authority to seal the deal for the entire church, right? And so he can be a one-man ecumenical council, but that doesn't mean that he speaks entirely against the church. He is speaking on behalf of the entire church. And so, literally speaking, the Pope can never speak without the consent of the church. That's in principle impossible because his mouth is the mouthpiece of the church, just as Peter was the mouthpiece of all the apostles and spoke on behalf of them on multiple occasions. The other thing I want to point out is that by Acts chapter 12, verse 17, it talks about how Peter began his ministry in Antioch. And so before we get to Acts chapter 15, Peter has already given up his rulership in Jerusalem and he's given it over to James. And so the reason why Peter doesn't appear, quote unquote, as prominent as James in Acts 15 is because he's not the bishop of Jerusalem anymore. He's been an evangelist. He's been going around. And so it's just fitting and proper that James would make the final declaration over his diocese. Now, I pointed out that it would be interesting if James didn't agree with Peter. What would Peter have said then? That's something kind of fun to think about. The second thing is that J.N.D. Kelly, in his book, the Dictionary of Popes, the Oxford Dictionary of Popes, he points out that within the first chapters of the book of Acts, specifically in Jerusalem, Peter is viewed as the undisputed leader of the early church. And so, Kelly cites all different examples, right? But it's interesting that at least J.N.D. Kelly notes that from the very beginning of the history of the church, Peter began acting as if he were the universal leader. He was the undisputed teacher of all the apostles. And so it isn't until later when the authority structure is spreading out and the church is defining the office of bishop and presbyter in other places, the apostles are being evangelists, that Peter, so to speak, lowers in his authority. And so that's how I'd respond to Acts 15, that objection there. I actually want to find the quote by J.N.D. Kelly. So if you just give me a quick second, because I think it's such a good quote. Because the fact is, J.N.D. Kelly is not a Catholic. He is an Anglican scholar. And so he would have no interest in promoting the papal claims, but here he is saying something very interesting. So let me see here. Here we go. So this is on page. They don't have the page numbers on this anyway. So this is on page 1. Okay. The first half of Acts discloses that after the ascension, though his relationship to James, the Lord's brother, remains unclear, Peter was the undisputed leader of the youthful church. And I've often joked that if we had the Peter of Acts 1 through 5, then there would be no question about Vatican I. But anyway, it was he who presided over the choice of a successor to Judas, 1:15-26, who explained to the crowd the meaning of Pentecost, 2:14-40, who healed the lame beggar at the temple, 3:1-10, who pronounced sentence on Ananias and Sapphira. Now, in my own published work and in my own online defenses of the papacy, I pointed out that in Acts chapter 5, verse 1-11, we actually do have evidence of the supremacy of Peter. And the reason why is because in Deuteronomy 17, verse 10 and onwards, it talks about, at least the Jews believe that was when Moses had instituted the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, the power of the rabbis. And then later on, in Jewish tradition, it was believed around the time of Jesus that Moses gave his seat or his chair, the power of the Sanhedrin, to Joshua. Now, in John 21:15-19, other scholars have pointed out that this is clearly an instance where Peter is a type of Joshua, and he receives the seat of Moses. And I've argued that confirmation of the fact that Peter received the seat of Moses is that when Ananias and Sapphira fall dead, it says, the first time it says all the people heard and were afraid. The second time it says the entire church heard and was afraid. In the Old Testament, whenever the Sanhedrin gave a definitive ruling and the person disagreed or disputed or disobeyed, it says that the person will be put to death and all the people will hear and be afraid. And so that's an example in which Peter had the entire power of the Sanhedrin in himself as the new Joshua. But anyway, and then he goes on to other points. But the case that I'm making here is that Peter clearly is the undisputed leader of the early church, and he does have this special primacy and authority. The last other point that you mentioned was just Luke 22, and so I often actually I don't often use Luke 22 as an example of for my work on the papacy, but I think it's worth mentioning because even though the devil is coming for all the apostles to sift them like wheat, that's what Jesus says. I have prayed that you, in the singular, in the Greek, sao, that your faith will not fail, and so that when you return, you will strengthen your brothers. So notice that even though the devil is coming after all the apostles, Jesus specifically prays for one apostle, that he'll be the one to return and strengthen his brothers. And even in Pope Leo's writings, Pope Leo talks about how even the shepherds of the church themselves need a shepherd. And so what I would say here is that just as, for instance, you have types that are repeated, right? So, for instance, you have the office of the priest, right? And then the office of the priest is kind of repeated in the office of bishop, right? So, the priest is like a shepherd, but the bishop is the more solemn, higher authority shepherd, right? But all of them are playing a part in feeding the flock of Christ. Well, Pope Leo would make the argument, well, the shepherds need a shepherd, and that's who we'd call the Pope.
And so that's an Eastern Orthodox saint and a Catholic saint.
Exactly, an Eastern Orthodox and a Catholic saint. And so I would say that Peter then is the bishop of the bishops. He is the apostle of the apostles.
All right. Thank you, Swan. I don't want to keep you for too long. So very quick, if you want to just say anything you want to plug in or for the audience to go look at more of your work. And I enjoyed having you on. So go ahead and plug whatever you want to plug.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Jonathyn. And, I'm kind of battling a cold. And so I don't know if you can, my voice is a little nasally. It's not as nice as usual. And so I hope it wasn't too distracting. But I have a YouTube channel and podcast called Intellectual Conservatism that has more of my content on the papacy and defending the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church. And you can find my work on medium.com or academia.edu. And just keep me in your prayers that eventually I'll be able to get my book published. It's been taking a while to write because I'm so busy with school. And so I actually might take a gap year after I graduate. And so just keep me in your prayers that everything will turn out well and that this book will represent the Orthodox and the Protestant, faith fairly in my assessment and defense of the Catholic Church.
Awesome. Thank you, Swan. God bless you. And we'll definitely keep that intention in our prayers. Thank you so much for coming on. If you ever want to come on again, we can talk about other stuff. And I don't want to take up your time. So everyone, thanks for tuning in.
All right. Thank you, Jonathyn.
Thank you.